Hi, everyone, and welcome to October. Happy trick-or-treating. I'm trying to get in the mood, hence the Hocus Pocus t-shirt. By the way, if y'all haven't seen Hocus Pocus 2, please don't. It literally destroyed the Hocus Pocus franchise for me. I am one of those cult followers for the original Hocus Pocus. It killed me and it almost killed Halloween. So I'm just saying, let me just save you, 2 hours of your life. Don't go see it. I want to welcome everybody to our October Unlock Higher Ed Coalition meeting. I want to be very mindful of folks' time. I'm waiting for Bradley Custer to zoom in as well. But if not, Sarah, you're going to be up. But I want to go ahead and just get started. If we could just do real quick, it'd probably be easier for me to just follow my screen across. Just say your name, your organization, where you're calling in from, and we'll start with Brenda.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Brenda Dan Mester. I'm Senior Advisor for the Education Strategy Group, and I'm calling in from Rhode Island.
Terrific. Misha.
Hi, my name is Micaiah.
Oh, sorry.
It's no worries. My name is Micaiah. I represent the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and I'm calling in from Washington, D.C.
Terrific. Welcome. And I'm so sorry I screwed your name up. Margaret.
Hi, Margaret DeZerga from the Vera Institute of Justice, calling in from Los Angeles.
Great. Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary Evans, and I am a graduate of P2P, and I'm calling in from Ohio.
Belinda.
Good day, everyone. Belinda Wheeler, Senior Program Associate from the Vera Institute of Justice, and I'm calling in from South Carolina today. Good to see you all.
Oh, wonderful. And Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Alpert. I'm calling in from New York. I work with Hudson Link for higher education in prison. And good to see everybody.
Will.
Everybody, I'm Will Emerson, Lansing Community College in Lansing, Michigan.
Jessica.
I'm Jessica Snow, Communications Team Manager with P2P.
Marianne.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marianne Rainey. I'm a program officer with the Sendium Education Group, and I'm calling in from Ohio.
Raj.
Hi, my name is Raj. I'm a research assistant at UNLV.
Bradley.
Hi, Bradley Custer at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Tony.
Good afternoon, everyone. I forgot to change my name on here. I'm Mark Taylor from Project Rebound in Humboldt County, California.
Hi, Mark. Judith.
Hello, everyone. I'm calling from Miami, Florida. I'm in the Speakers Bureau and the mentor for P2P and also reentry program, the Freedom Globe.
Wonderful. I see a Terrell's Otter.
Yeah, that's actually a note taker, artificial intelligence, but I'll go ahead and speak. Terrell Blunt, formerly incarcerated College Graduates Network, Durham, North Carolina.
Rebecca.
Hi, good morning. Rebecca Silbert, California Community Colleges. I'm calling from Oakland, California.
Kayla.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kayla Elliott. I'm the Director of Higher Ed Policy at EdTrust in Washington, D.C.
Talia.
Hi, I'm Talia. I'm calling in from the First 72 Plus in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Wonderful. And Mike.
Hello, everyone. Mike Leach with Southeast Arkansas College in Pine Bluff, Arkansas.
Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We do have a very packed agenda. So if this is your first meeting, welcome. Oh, Alan, I'm sorry. I just saw yours. Alan.
Oh, that's all right. Alan Walkendorfer of Vera Institute.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. If you are new, if this is your first meeting, I hope you will come back. We have a lot of exciting work ahead of us. And with that, that's the perfect segue to our federal subcommittee group. And I'm going to turn that over to both Bradley and to Sarah, who are going to talk about the PEP regs. And as we all know, we're reading it, we're digesting it. So I'm going to turn it over to Bradley and to Sarah.
Hi, everybody. So on Thursday, the new regulation for the Pell Grant program was released by the Department of Education. I'm going to drop in the chat just a Twitter thread that I put together on Friday with what I just think are some of the highlights, some of the main changes. And I certainly welcome Sarah and others to hear your observations on what you think is important to highlight. So overall, there are no major surprises in here. There are no like radical changes to the structure of how this process is going to work as far as how colleges will get approval to administer programs that are funded by Pell Grants. But to highlight a couple of the big changes that I think do speak to all of our advocacy, perhaps the most important things are 3 changes to the metrics that will be used to evaluate programs. The more important one is that all of the outcomes that come from, well, yes, they're outcomes, they're post-release outcomes that were going to be used to evaluate a program have now been made optional. So in the beginning, when this whole process started, there were 7 or 8 metrics, data elements that were required to be evaluated according to the Department of Education. They wanted corrections agencies to evaluate every program on all of these metrics. The first time that they amended this list was during negotiated rulemaking. They took 2 of them off the table from the required list to the optional list, and that was recidivism and completion rates. And now and they insisted that the others should be required. Through this next phase of changes, after they reviewed all of our comment letters, they conceded again and moved some more of those metrics into the optional category. And so what will be required are some of the input metrics, things like, faculty turnover rates and okay, now I'm blanking. But then the ones that got moved are the things like post-release earnings and post-release education attainment. Those things are now all not required, which eases the pressure on colleges and DOCs who were saying we simply do not have access to those data. And so now they're not going to feel as hamstrung trying to get those data. They also tinkered with the earnings metric. And the other one that I thought that was really important was there was a little piece tacked on to the end of one of the requirements related to post-release transfer. There was a little provision that just sort of gave a wink to colleges, allowing them, sort of giving them permission to deny a formerly incarcerated person admission outside of prison. And the department took that piece out. So that's not to say that colleges can't and won't still do that, but at least that little piece is not in the regulation anymore. So I thought that was important. I think one of the other things that was important was they clarified a little bit how the first approval will go. This is called the 2-year initial approval process, which, by the way, the department declined to change the length of. Some people thought that should have been shorter. Some people thought that should have been longer. And they said, nope, we're going to stick with 2 years. And they gave a rationale. They said there are other programs not related to prison education that they do a 2-year approval for. So they thought 2 years was the right amount of time. But what they clarified was that the determination of best interest, which is the evaluation process that uses those metrics that I described, does not happen until after the 2-year initial review process, which I think we all believed was going to happen because you can't evaluate things until you actually have data to evaluate. So what they explained was that departments of corrections or the oversight entity will have to come up with some kind of criteria on their own for how they give that initial 2-year approval. They said they're not going to regulate it. And so they will do what they do as far as coming up with, what they think makes for a good prison education program. If they give the approval and the accreditor gives the approval, then that program will be allowed to start getting Pell Grants to their students. And then the big evaluation comes 2 years later. And that's the process that is probably the more complicated process, which overall did not change in the final regulation, except for tinkering with the metrics the way I just described. So I think the other piece that we didn't get that I know some people asked for was an appeals process. This is where if a college applies to a DOC and the DOC rejects the application and says, no, you are not allowed to become a prison education program that gets Pell Grants, there's no real way for a college to push back against that except to reapply. So colleges are still allowed to reapply, but there is no appeals process. And the department declined to add that, saying that essentially it's too administratively and perhaps legally complicated to create. And that stems from the fact that the Department of Education does not have legal oversight of a corrections department. So it's kind of like, who would you appeal to? That's sort of like the main crux of that problem. So we didn't get an appeals process, and I think there are still open questions about how about accountability as far as when a college feels like a Department of Corrections is not doing things correctly, how do they seek relief? And I think there are answers to that question. They're just not detailed in this regulation. So the last thing I'll say, and then certainly want to open it up for others' reactions, is that in the coming weeks, there's supposed to be a website from the Department of Education where they're going to start posting guidance, dear colleague letters, information about what all of these regulations mean and what all of these entities are supposed to start, how they're supposed to start preparing. So no more specific details on when that's coming, but I think by the end of the year, we're supposed to get more information with some of that guidance. And I know for me, that's sort of the next step in thinking ahead as far as on what we should be doing next. So I will pause there. To Judith, no.
You would think after 2 years, I would learn to take myself off mute. I want to open it up for Margaret and Sarah, because I know that they've been working on this as well. And I want to just see if there's any other clarification. Sarah, if there's anything that we wanted to touch on from the federal subcommittee meeting this morning. And then, Margaret, we'll get to your event. I can put the link in the chat for that as well. But I did want to open it up and Dr. Wheeler.
Sure. So we met as like a subcommittee for Unlock this morning and kind of talked about some things that we're thinking about and next steps potentially. And so a couple of things that we discussed were that at this point, pretty much it's going from the federal level to the state level, where the Department of Corrections are going to be these oversight entities, and starting to think through kind of what each state might want to adopt as a stakeholder group, or present that to your Department of Corrections, as well as like an advisory group, like kind of being proactive about helping to create that on your state level and having those conversations sooner rather than later. We also talked about potentially people in New York and New Jersey and bringing in other people from across the country to come together about that initial assessment criteria, rather waiting for the oversight entity, which is the Department of Corrections, to come up with that. Is there a possibility that programs across the country kind of can work together proactively to help create that criteria? So I think we're going to hopefully meet about that over the next couple of weeks. And then I'm not sure, I'm in an open office floor plan, and we're getting a water system installed. So I'm not sure if I heard everything that Bradley said, but I also wanted to highlight that second chance Pell sites will have to reapply for Pell eligibility, but it's not clear what the timeline is on that phase out. And then I'll turn it over to anyone else.
Margaret, Dr. Wheeler?
Yeah, so Kimberly, thanks for putting the link to the webinar in the chat. We're hosting a webinar in a couple of weeks, and we'll have folks from the Department of Education on the line who we anticipate being part of the Q&A. So you're all invited to register for that. We will record it. So if you want to register, then we'll be sending you the recording if you can't make it live. But that's coming up. And I guess one thing that just to flag, the NPR, the notice of proposed rulemaking from the summer referenced there would be some kind of like application type form coming from the Department of Education for PEPs to use. And it sounds like that is still forthcoming. So, you know, I think, Sarah, your point about like being proactive and like how to bring together stakeholders is great. And at the same time, I would want people to go into that process knowing that this template or form or whatever is forthcoming. So it's not that the expectation is not that DOCs would be coming up with criteria from scratch. And a lot of it, as you all know, is referenced in the regs. So that's kind of on the list of things that would still be coming.
Dr. Wheeler, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Thanks for that, Kimberly. No, not really. I think Margaret summarized everything. One thing I will lift up, just for anyone who this may be news of, you know, this information and hearing Bradley's stuff for the first time, and thank you, Bradley, for that summary. What we got last week was the regulatory language. So this is for any college that's currently not in the Second Chance Pell experiment, and like this language moving forward post July 1st of 2023 for those particular entities. For any current Second Chance Pell college, just to kind of highlight to everyone that there is going to be sub-regulatory language coming from the Department of Education with more information about how current Second Chance Pell programs will be eventually transitioning into those PEP programs. So if anyone reads those regulations hoping, you know, that you're a current Second Chance Pell college and you're like, what do I need to do right away? We don't have that language yet. That's coming from the Department of Ed in the coming weeks. So just wanted to, you know, flag that and then just lift up the webinar. We're hoping that by the time the webinar, you know, happens on November 17th, that there will have been at least some other materials, you know, from the Department of Ed, which will have dropped. And in addition, I should mention too, in addition to us talking about the regulations in the webinar, my colleague Alan, who's on the call with us today, there's a period of time dedicated to the webinar where he's going to be talking about financial aid and those kind of implications kind of moving forward with the information that we have at hand, you know, come November 17th. So just wanted to mention that as well for anyone who's very interested in the financial aid stuff. Thank you, Kimberly.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Are there any questions for Sarah, Margaret, Belinda, Bradley? I know this is a lot. We put the links into the chat, so please take a look at those as well. This has been kind of like a long process, and I think we're kind of getting excited about things gearing up now. Bradley, I did want to talk on one thing, because you know it's something that is important to me, is the relevant, what do we call it? Relevant stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know it's referenced in there, and if I was confused about it, I want to make sure that, you know, everybody else understands that part of the regs.
Yes, I think this will be really important for all of us, because this will be how many of our organizations stay involved in this process, perhaps by participating as a relevant stakeholder, advising DOCs on specific programs as they're being, you know, applied, or as they're applying. So there actually wasn't much about this in the it's called the preamble, just the sort of explanation of the final regulation. There were some organizations that asked to expand this group, and they declined to expand. But basically, there are sort of two things here, two terms. One is the advisory committee, and one is the relevant stakeholders. The relevant stakeholders is a group of people that during negotiated rulemaking, the department said, and through the regulation requires, the oversight entity is required to solicit feedback from this group called the relevant stakeholders. And there's a list of people in the regulation who has to be included in that group. And that includes organizations that represent incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, your accrediting agencies, your state higher education agency, and there might be a couple others. That's the group that the department during this, basically on Thursday, said that they didn't want to expand it anymore. In other words, they didn't want to add any more specific groups to that list, but the DOCs, sorry, the oversight entities are allowed to solicit feedback from other groups if they're not included on that list. So I know that was kind of a mouthful. The feedback that an oversight entity collects from those relevant stakeholders is non-binding, which just means that an oversight entity can reach a different conclusion, can come to a different decision than what was proposed by the relevant stakeholders, but they do have to be involved in the process. The other term is the advisory committee, which is perhaps an organization of the relevant stakeholders. So some states could choose to create an advisory committee of those relevant stakeholders, or they could not do the advisory committee thing and just work with relevant stakeholders individually. That's going to be up to states how they want to organize that process. But to kind of circle back to what I started with, us on this, in this group, in our organizations, we could be tapped in the future to be a relevant stakeholder, which means we would have eyes on a prison education program application, and we would advise on the strengths and weaknesses of that. That advice, that feedback would be going to the corrections department or the oversight entity to consider when they are approving or not approving a particular program. That's just sort of my vision of how I think that would work. We don't have guidance on this yet, and I think the department is probably not going to want to be too prescriptive on how states organize their relevant stakeholders and their advisory committees, because that's sort of the point, was building in some flexibility there. But elements of that are required. So as an oversight function, we do need to be making sure that oversight entities are looping in those relevant stakeholders as they're reviewing program applications.
Can you talk a little bit about the hierarchy of all of this? And, so starting from like the ground level where we're inside the prison. And let's say we've been able to negotiate with our DOCs to be a part of this state-based advisory. And so can you talk a little bit about the work that we could do with that, and then where that goes and sort of go up the chain?
So I think there's a couple of things happening in what you're describing, specifically related to the function of the relevant stakeholders. They are going to be a group of people that we get feedback from on individual college program applications. How structured that is will be up to the state. I think what you're also talking about, though, is sort of in general, building support and capacity and collaboration among partners for this whole process. Mm-hmm. That's also kind of up to the willingness and kind of level of organization of states as they determine how much they want people to be involved in developing this. One of the conversations that we had in the federal subcommittee meeting was just talking through that first step, which is how does a DOC determine that they should give the initial approval to a program? That could be an opportunity for groups to be involved in helping to shape the criteria for how they make that initial approval. Again, because I think the department is not going to want to get involved there. They said specifically it's up to DOCs on how to do that. So, I mean, I think like all of the options are on the table for the extent to which groups can try to be involved and build collaborative relationships. There's nothing set in stone as far as how we as organizations can be involved in this process.
Thank you. I'm looking too that one of the other things that we had talked about was the possibility of doing a standalone event sometime in December to kind of talk through this a little bit more, to sort of make it an open meeting, not one of our normally regularly scheduled Unlock Higher Ed meetings. But Bradley, I also wanted you to sort of touch real quick, if you could please, on, because I think we may hear it, is some of the advocate pushback that you got on a recent call, and sort of like the why, the how, and then the finality statement, if you would, because I'm sure that those of us that are in this space that interact with some of these advocates, and Sarah as well, because I know you were on that call, what we may hear and what that pushback was.
Yeah, thanks for that. So first of all, I don't work for the Department of Education, and I'm not here to be their cheerleader or defender or anything like that. Anyway, a lot of us on this call, like literally Belinda and other, like, we're on the negotiated rulemaking committee. We watched every hour of it. We were very engaged. We're educated about the process. We sort of understand the limits of that process. And we rolled with it because we had to. I think there are others. I guess the big thing I didn't mention at the top when I was describing changes, because it wasn't a change, is that the Department of Education did not take departments of corrections out of this process. They are still the main approvers, and that was always a main contention, and it will continue to be a contention. There's not much we can do about that anymore. And there is, this is a final regulation. In other words, it's gone through the entire legal process, and it sort of is what it is. And again, it's not like my job, or responsibility to make everybody like be happy with what we got. But we just are limited now in what changes we can see, and kind of where our complaints will go about this. So I guess I just want to offer, and certainly I want to hear from others, if people don't kind of fully understand the process of how we got to where we are today, there are a lot of us on the call, including me, who can sort of help walk us through that, and again, just explain the limitations of this process. I know a lot of people have a lot of feelings about how neg reg went. I do too. And so does the department when you talk to some people offline about how all of that went down. But I don't have a good way to like close out my thought on that, except to say that we have a final reg, and we just kind of have to move forward with what we've got. There will always be opportunities though for continued advocacy, which means if we need to fix this program, we have a Congress for that. We have a Department of Education. I mean, they would have to go through negotiated rulemaking again, which would be painful, but nothing is permanent in life, right? Like it is possible to change this program if something needs fixed. We're just sort of in a moment now where we have to see kind of where this lands. We've got to sit with it a little bit, and then we can really dig into the opportunities and the challenges that we still have. So I'm going to leave it with that. I don't know if that makes anybody feel better or worse about this. Again, I'm not trying to defend anything or anyone here, but I just hope that we can all kind of like move forward with, with what we've got.
Thank you, Bradley.
Kimberly, if I could just say a couple.
Absolutely.
I think there are two things I'd like to respond. One is I think we need to keep copious notes on the challenges we're confronting, and make sure we inform our congressional delegations and congressional leaders on changes that we'll want to see. But I do think at this point, we need to think about pivoting to the state level and working with our DOCs and our state higher education officials. And I would also suggest we need to work with the governor's office, since many of them appoint the DOC directors, and or the SHIOs may report to the governor's office. So I just wanted to suggest, Sarah, you mentioned it. I do think it's a strategy we need to consider, is how do we approach our state elected officials in this work?
No, I think that's great. And we did talk about that at the federal subcommittee this morning, about what that, how do you get to that state-based, and what states do we have the good relationships with, and we've also talked about trying to create, sort of like a criteria that, that we would like to see, and then being able to sort of track all of that and create that database that, we could plug in the things that we're looking at, what is good, what is unique, what is problematic, that sort of thing, because we are going to have to be able to back up anything that we want to go forward on with that data. So we talked about creating that. Did I miss anything on that one, Sarah or Bradley, on the database? All right, so we will be working on that. I know that Sarah is going to be working on with Sheila on reaching out to some specific states to kind of get sort of like the model template that we can use. But obviously we welcome anybody's input on what you think that we should be tracking, what we should be looking at, what we should be keeping track of and researching. Certainly we want everybody's voice to be represented in it. So if you have any of those suggestions, you can certainly, just email them to me, and then we'll create that massive doc that I'll send to Sarah and Sheila. We had another thing on the agenda that, Bradley, you're just talking a lot today, my friend. Margaret talked about her webinar, but I want you to talk about the incarcerated borrowers update that you have for us. And I'm going to put the link in the chat.
Thanks. And yes, I'm talking too much, and definitely I hope this is sort of my last spotlight. Meanwhile, setting Pell aside for a second, student debt cancellation is happening. Well, sort of. It's the plan is in. Things are moving with it. The application is live. Over 20 million people have already applied for cancellation, but we know that incarcerated borrowers are not getting good information. They still don't have a good pathway or mechanism to apply or even get information about it. And so, again, kind of overlapping coalitions here, but we talked about this a little bit in the federal subcommittee and also in another ad hoc group that focuses specifically on incarcerated borrowers. We decided that the most direct way to get information about student debt cancellation to incarcerated borrowers is through the Department of Justice, sort of trickle down from the top down to facilities. We don't think the Department of Education by itself actually has a way to get information into prisons. And so I took first pen on a letter that our organizations can sign on to that advocates for the Department of Education to tell DOJ to tell facilities to distribute information. It's kind of, again, there's like lots of dotted lines there. I have good reason to believe that FSA is working on materials, and it sounds like they're going to convene a stakeholder briefing to ask what the best way to distribute that information is. So this letter is just sort of, getting ahead of that a little bit by proposing one strategy that we all talked about. So anyway, I welcome your organization's signatures on this, and if you have feedback about content, you can just email that directly to me. Any questions or comments, please let me know. I put a due date on it for Monday, 1 week to look over the letter, add your name on there, and then I will get it sent to the education department. Thanks.
At the briefing that they're going to do, and they're trying to figure out the best way, is that something that members of this coalition or, organizations will be able to Zoom into or be a part of?
It's a good question. These stakeholder briefings that have been happening sort of during the Biden administration, it's like they just sort of like, when they hear that groups are interested, they invite them. So I think we can send them names when it happens. If it happens, I will see the extent to which we can get those opened up. There are some rules about which groups are allowed to be invited. So for example, like reporters are not allowed in those meetings, and certain people who work at certain types of organizations are not allowed to be in those meetings. But I think the idea is, yes, they want to hear from us. So I will make sure everybody's updated when that meeting happens.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Margaret, you have your hand up?
So just for what it's worth, there are like standing meetings between BJA, BOP, and ED on Pell reinstatement. Those obviously also are already encompassing this these other very related issues about debt relief for people who are incarcerated. So in case it's good to know, those channels are wide open. I think the rate limiting step right now, frankly, is for the Department of Education to have some more clarity about some of its guidance and how people who can't utilize an online system can participate in those processes. So I think I'm certainly not saying, I'm not dissuading any kind of a letter. I just want you to know that there are things underway. And I think once there is a specific, guidance document or something like that, that is like official and done, then there's a lot of great ways we could think about getting the word out through, Angel Sanchez raised on a different call, the idea of some of the newsletters and things like that are going directly to incarcerated people. We can imagine sort of going through the Marshall Project and their News Inside. I mean, all those kinds of more existing channels, as well as more, low tech options of staff within the DOCs getting information, out in ways that they do for other kinds of information, and then engaging with groups that work with family members of incarcerated people. So there's definitely a lot of routes in. I think the rate limiting step is just having that kind of official guidance done and some of the paper-based remedies available.
Would somebody like to answer Stephanie's question in the chat?
Yeah, really anybody who before they were
Thank you,
in
Sarah.
prison yep, that was it, thanks. Anybody in prison who before being in prison took out student loans is eligible for student debt cancellation because their income is below $125,000. And then there are additional steps for people whose loans are in default. There's another program that we actually don't have all the details about yet that should be coming later this year. So anyway, those borrowers need information just like the borrowers outside of prison need. And so that's what we're talking about here.
Bradley, is that also in the letter, information about that? Like DOCs have to get that information inside?
Yeah, that's sort of the intent, is that both cancellation information and the information about default just needs to be distributed kind of evenly and proactively. Was that your question?
Yeah. Because I know that we all also have, other informal channels. And once we have that formal information, then, we can also use our informal networks to get it inside as much as we possibly can. So
That's
thank
right.
you for that. Does anybody have any other questions about these issues? Crickets, huh? No questions, huh?
Well, and I'll just flag again, I put it in the chat earlier, but the Federal Student Aid Office is having its virtual conference right after Thanksgiving. It's free to register, and there is a session, it looks like it's going to be on November 30th, that's specifically about incarcerated students. So if you're really interested more in the financial aid stuff, or if there are people at colleges you're working with who you think should be there, that's a session to flag for them.
Oh, that's great. And your session is November 7th. Your webinar is November 7th, correct?
17th.
17th, sorry. Why am I thinking the 7th, y'all? Telling you, it's hocus pocus too. All right, well, if nobody else has any more questions for Second Chance Pell, Raj. Does anybody have any other questions?
Kimberly, I'll ask one real quick. Can you hear me?
Sure.
So this might be for Margaret. So with the Fresh Start, Margaret, real quickly, what just how does that work for students that are incarcerated? I mean, we have a bunch of students. We just started our program, but a bunch this last fall were in default, and so we obviously couldn't get them qualified for Pell. But just wondering, how, is it a quick process with Fresh Start, or just real quickly tell me what's involved, please?
Sure. Alan, are you in a position to give a little more background since you've been working with some of the colleges on that?
Sure, yeah. So if you're trying to get an incarcerated student who's in default right now enrolled, and they weren't previously qualified for Pell because they had loans in default, The process is rather simple. They fill out a FAFSA, and when the financial aid office from the college gets their institutional their ICER report back, it'll flag them for a default, and then the financial aid office looks up to see if those loans qualify for Fresh Start. If they do, then the student can get enrolled, and there's a couple other things they have to do, but it's really quite simple. Then they become eligible for Pell. So the problem with it is that it's student triggered, and so the student needs to fill out a FAFSA to trigger the financial aid office to see that they have a default, and then they have a process they go through to see they qualify. The other way some students are triggering this process is by calling the default resolution center, and that's sort of getting a letter sent. But you could have a proactive financial aid office who goes and seeks out students who are in default and enrolls them. That's the other option. Not all of them are being that proactive, but some are.
So Alan, real quick follow-up. So if we already have a FAFSA on some students, we already got information back in our financial aid office that they are in default. We just need to have our financial aid people look into whether we can process Fresh Start for these folks and get them qualified for Pell. Is that right?
Yeah, as long as it's a current FAFSA for the current financial aid year.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
That's great. Thank you so much for that question. Any other questions around these issues? All right, well, I'm going to turn it now over to Mary Evans. She is on the event subcommittee, and she wanted to propose something that the steering committee actually talked about after I had the conversation in that subcommittee meeting. And it is something that the steering committee would like to explore with this body about what that might look like. So I will turn it over to Mary Evans.
I have to tell you, we've talked about so much, I don't know which idea you wanted me to present.
The event with housing.
Oh, yes. So recently I've been doing a lot of work. I've been writing some op-eds and stuff, and just doing some research about housing and some of the issues that folks are having, especially around in this area and in the state of Ohio when they return. And so I don't know what it would look like. I don't know what we could possibly do, but to bring awareness to some of those issues. I've been volunteering with this program called Jumpstart, which guarantees employment and helping people secure housing before they leave. However, not everyone's qualified to get into those things. And there's also been a couple situations where I've helped people who were leaving, who were also enrolled in college and were, homeless college students, which is something that we hear about a lot. But it's just, how can we ensure that people who are formerly incarcerated leaving actually has something set in stone in place, so that way they can actually focus on the real issue, which is getting their education so that they can be a better person, get sustainability. And I don't know what that would really even look like or entail, but that's just something that's been calling to me. It's a real serious issue here in Ohio. Every year there's 20,000 of us released, 1,500 of us come back to Montgomery County alone. And those numbers don't lie. And I know that there's some people right now struggling with housing and have to really make a choice, like, do I quit school so I can work, or, and it's kind of like, how do we find that balance? And, how can we build something from that to also ensure that, when people are leaving, that they can actually get the degree that they're going to get and not have to worry about if I'm going to be homeless or not. And I just think if we can alleviate some of those things, and focusing on the education would be like the easiest part of it. In my real world, in my dream world, I think the mental health, accessibility, and housing are the two main things that can essentially change someone's life and have them be successful, and they can get so much further, because I know that's what worked for me. Might not work for everyone else, but I know that those are really important. So I don't know what that can look like and what we could actually do. The letter that the article that I wrote made enough noise that Senator Sherrod Brown wrote me a personal letter and said that he would help me in any way, and gave me some grant information and said that he would write a letter of support. So there is opportunity for funding for this. It's just, I don't know how we can execute it to implicate education and the housing component together.
Mary, would you share that link with you can put it in the chat or send it to me and I can send it back out?
Yes.
Because I know that, well, we said this when we were doing like ban the box on employment, but the idea of, if you don't have a safe place to lay your head, you can't think about school, and you can't, think about school, and it's a vicious cycle because we get people hyped up about school and they get engaged in it, and it's a pathway out of poverty and prison. And then, the very real world of the housing piece, triggers people dropping out, and then we won't get them back. I know that somebody had said that it was a research project that if they came out and they were continuously engaged in higher education, but then life happened, like housing or something else, and they dropped out of school, they never came back, which is just a shame because of all the hard work that they did while they were on the inside. Sarah, you have your hand up.
I was just going to offer to Mary, if she, in New York at Hudson Link, we run college programs inside 6 correctional facilities, and seeing the same issue with housing of our alumni coming home. A few years ago, we launched a New Beginnings program where we actually purchased dilapidated homes, hire alumni to work alongside skilled contractors to rehab those homes, and then they become homes for our alumni to live in. So we have a men's house open, a women's house open. We're on construction for our 3rd and have just bought our 4th. So if you want to talk to our New Beginnings team here in New York to see what we've been doing, if that would be helpful for thinking about what's going on in Ohio. And so it's our alumni or people that haven't finished their degree while inside come home. We've had a lot of students finish their degrees while living in the house, get jobs. Some of them have gone on to own their own homes already. So it's a model similar to try to address both the educational aspect and the housing. So if you would want to talk to our folks here to think through Ohio, we're happy to do that. I can put my email in the chat for you.
Thank you.
Stephanie, do you want to talk about the link that you just put in the chat?
Oh, no, it just certainly doesn't resolve the issues, but it does tease out some of what's being discussed in terms of what you were saying, like you can't have education if you don't have a home to go back to and you don't have a place. So this was one of 2 we did a public comment dedicated to it, which I can share. And also this is the memorandum that has this particular link has the interviews with people talking about how all of these issues like housing insecurity, food insecurity, housing, all of that is part of education, and we need to be constantly thinking about that and why that's on the Department of Education and the on-prison education programs to be cognizant of.
No, I think you hit it right on the head. We need to start thinking about, for the longest time, we were like solely focused on issues. And now there's such an intersectionality between all of this that we need to look at like that whole picture kind of thing. And so what Mary had suggested at the last events meeting was that maybe we could do some sort of event, whether that was, certainly we don't have the budget for an in-person, let me just kill that one right there. But maybe that we could do some sort of, a forum or a roundtable or a something, and so we wanted to just kind of let the coalition know if there was something that you thought we might be able to consider, certainly let Mary know. It would be great to build on this. The steering committee is behind it. It's just, we want to make sure that it's representative of what everybody on the coalition would like to see and the issues that it could raise, and also what the format could be. Is it a forum? Is it a, I don't know, Facebook Live thing? There's so many different ways that we could have this discussion, but we wanted to bring it to the full coalition. Mary, was there anything else that the events committee was thinking about?
No, that's all at the time. That's all at the time, just kind of like figuring out how we can consolidate the housing issue with education, which we pretty much just kind of like did that. And then going from there, and then to answer Judith's question, I would love to know which major colleges are open to accepting. Antioch College, I essentially paroled to them. And that's where I lived the first year. I could have stayed there the whole time, but wanting to have independence and get my own place and stuff, I had free housing for a year. So I think what would be like really great and in my wishful world would be that these college institutions would provide more scholarship-based opportunities for formerly incarcerated folks that are transitioning. So then that way, maybe paroling to campus is an option, you know, whether it be an off-campus housing situation or on campus. It worked great for me because it was like a step down to another institution. It was almost like a halfway house kind of setup for me, which I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to have the housing along with the education, but that's not always someone else's, you know, story or chance. So maybe if there's a way for some of these major colleges to have that scholarship option, or maybe have those kinds of housing options for folks to further their education. I mean, they're coming in as a transfer, they're going to get the, you know, financial aid money and stuff from them. So it's like, how can we ensure that these people are going to get through, you know, and beat the retention rate and like actually graduate and just, you know, be successful and then come back and be alumni and pay it forward. I mean, that's kind of essentially what you want to do at an educational institution anyway. So
I love the
thinking
idea
about
of
it,
being paroled to a university.
yeah. So thinking about those kinds of things and which colleges might be open to that. And if there is extra funding around that and how they can actually, you know, incorporate student loans, or I'd hate for them to do loans, but like some kind of scholarship funding or something to help with the housing component of it. So then that way they can complete their education.
Judith, Kayla just put something in about a report that they did. Oh, that would be great, Kayla. Margaret, you had your hand up?
Excuse me, Mary, I'm happy to follow up with you over email and just, you know, we could set up a time, but there's some great folks in Ohio who work on housing access for people in reentry. And maybe there's some ways we could engage them. There's a woman named Katie Kitchen at the Corporation for Supportive Housing in Ohio in particular, who I think could be a good resource. And they have some housing that's actually funded through ODRC. So there's sort of buy-in by the state, as well as like other kinds of funding for housing.
Yeah. I would love that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Well, I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So we've rescheduled Noel's presentation on Ban the Box, his training. We did send out on the agenda that Erin Corbett is looking for a program director if you want to reach out to her if you're interested in that position. And we had some articles that kind of came across our feed that we wanted to share with everybody. And so you'll start getting a little bit more of those as we move forward. And our next meeting will be, you think I have my calendar up already, y'all? November 28th, the Monday after Thanksgiving. So I hope everybody has a wonderful Halloween. Enjoy trick-or-treating if you trick-or-treat. Give lots of candy, give the full-size candy bars, not those little ones. And don't watch Hocus Pocus 2. With that note, thank you, everybody, and we will see you next month. Reach out if you have any announcements, any job postings, any sort of articles, or if you're published anywhere, let us know so our comms team can put that information out. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.